In some cases, the rubber does hit the road. In Russia, they never get emancipated until the Bolsheviks. But in France and in America, they do get emancipated. And now they have to grapple with, well, what do we keep and what do we don't? What parts of Jewishness can be preserved in an emancipated, participating in the surrounding culture setting, and what parts are going to have to change or even go away. And from the government's perspective, now these Jews are in a different category. Remember, they used to be a nation, a collective identity. They had collective rights. Are we willing to give them full, equal rights as citizens? Or are there problems we have to grapple with? So if you go back a little earlier in the packet, this is on packet page 10. In 1806, Napoleon, who had by this time become Emperor of France, paradoxically fulfilling the ideals of the revolution by becoming an autocratic dictator. Sometimes you got to break an egg to make an omelet. Assembled a collection of both rabbis and lay Jewish leaders, the Machers, to answer a series of questions about Jewish integration into France. They already had the right to vote based on decisions taken 15 years before. But the question was, how far could they integrate? So we'll take a look at a few of these questions, and when I read the question, we want to think about, why does Napoleon care about this issue? What is the traditional Jewish answer? And what does the assembly actually answer? We'll look at it in a minute. So again, as I look at the question, why does Napoleon care? And what's the traditional answer here? First question, is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Why does Napoleon care?
There'd be more children.
More Jews. Okay.
Well, he wants European law, not Arabic, Jewish,
Foreign
laws.
Right.
Sharia versus
the dominant
American.
culture in Europe was one spouse. And so if you're going to do something so different from our cultural norms or from what our laws allow, then how can you be fully integrated? So what's the traditional Jewish answer to that question?
It depends.
Well, the biblical answer was sure. And actually, for Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews, the answer was yes into the 20th century. But Ashkenazi Jews had a ban on polygamy. It was a 1,000-year ban that was enacted in the year 1000. Now, if you've done the math, you might realize that ban is expired, unless you go set up a JDate profile for yourself. The Orthodox authorities of the day, 15 years ago, decided we're just going to keep going with that. That's what we've done for so long, we're going to keep that tradition running. So the traditional Jewish answer was yes, in theory, and of course they knew that Christians read the Bible too. They know about Moses, they know about Solomon, they know about David, multiple wives. So here's their answer. It is not lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife. In all European countries, they conform to the general practice marrying only one. Moses does not command expressly to take several, but he does not forbid it. And they point out that there's been a ban in the West that prohibits it, even though in some cases in the East, Jews still are allowed to do it. And the last line, although the prohibition was not to last forever, the influence of European manners has universally prevailed. So what Napoleon wanted, he got, right? He wanted an answer saying, we'll follow the general norms of your society, and that's the answer they gave. Second question. Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid when not pronounced by courts of justice by virtue of laws in contradiction with those of the French Code? So why does Napoleon care?
He wants them to conform to the French practice.
Notice that second clause there, in contradiction with the French Code. Are you going to fulfill this if we say no? What's the traditional answer? Is divorce allowed in Jewish life?
Yes.
Yes. And ironically, that's more in conforming with French Enlightenment Revolution practice than with the Catholic Church, which didn't allow divorce. So they wanted the answer to be yes. We want you to be allowed to be divorced because French law allows it. And then the question is, what's the relationship between French law and Jewish law? So the answer, the one-sentence version, repudiation is allowed by the law of Moses, but it is not valid if not previously pronounced by the French code. Is that what it says in the Talmud? But, again, they're trying to give an answer that's going to be what they want. And you'll see, again, they overdo it in the next paragraph. In the eyes of every Israelite, without exception, submission to the prince is the first of duties. Okay? And so, it is a principle generally acknowledged among them. In everything related to civil or political interest, the law of the state is the supreme law. Now, there is a rabbinic principle. The Aramaic is dina de malchuta dina. The law of the state is the law. Except there are plenty of cases where Jewish law supersedes that principle, and so they're overselling it a little bit here. Third question. Can a Jewess marry a Christian and a Jew a Christian woman? Or does the law allow the Jews to marry only among themselves? Why does Napoleon care? Does he have his eye on a Jewish woman he's looking at? Why does he care?
Assimilation?
Integration. What are the three principles of the French Revolution? Liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Brotherhood. We are one family. And so if there's a group among us that refuses to marry anybody else outside of their group, then that's not fraternity. That is high barriers. That is a nation within a nation. In the debate over Jewish emancipation, they said, to the Jews, everything is individuals, but nothing is a nation. No collective rights. So what's the traditional Jewish answer?
Traditional? No.
No.
Right. Sitting Shiva. It's rejection. Fat. How dare you? Here's their answer from the assembly. The law does not say that a Jewess cannot marry a Christian, nor a Jew or Christian woman, nor does it state that the Jews can only marry among themselves. Wow. Interesting innovation. The only marriages forbidden are those with the 7 Canaanite nations. It's absolute regarding them. And the modern nations are not to be considered as such. And there have been several intermarriages between Jews and Christians in France, Spain, and Germany. Sometimes the non-Jewish powers prohibited them. And they say in the beginning of the second paragraph, unions of this kind are still found in France, but we cannot deny the opinion of the rabbis is against these marriages. Now, why are the rabbis opposed to them? According to this, for a rabbi to officiate, they would have to do kiddushin, the traditional Jewish rituals, and they couldn't do that if both partners didn't consider it sacred. It's a psychological reason, not an ethnic, ethnocentric, or revealed religion reason. And so in the latter part of that second paragraph, this could not be done toward persons who would not both of them consider the ceremonies as sacred, and in that the married couple could separate without religious divorce. They would be considered married civilly, but not religiously. This is brand new. The concept of a civil marriage.
Great.
Separate from and it's true for Christians too. Yep. The idea of having a civil, secular, government-sanctioned marriage. Such is the opinion of the rabbis. In general, they would be no more inclined to bless the union of a Jewess with a Christian, or a Jew with a Christian woman, than Catholic priests themselves would be disposed to sanction unions of this kind. So it's not just us. The Catholics aren't so hot on this mixed ceremony either. The rabbis acknowledge, however, that a Jew who marries a Christian woman does not cease on that account to be considered as a Jew by his brothers, any more than if he had married a Jewess civilly and not religiously. There's two things here. One is a Jew who marries a Christian is still Jewish and still considered Jewish, even if they're breaking one of those cardinal laws. The category of, quote, bad Jew now begins to emerge. In Spinoza's day, what would they have done? Cherem, out, gone. In the Enlightenment period, in the Emancipated period, where everyone's a citizen, rabbinic authority, Jewish authority now is diminished. We can't enforce all these practices on people anymore, or the limits and the boundaries we used to do, because they're going to do what they want to do. And also notice, he could marry someone Jewish, civilly but not religiously. Again, the concept of a Jew marrying a Jew but not through the rabbinate, inconceivable before, but now that courthouse is open to anybody. And so you could marry a Jew civilly and not religiously. Next question. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as their brethren, or are they considered as strangers? Why does Napoleon want to know? Fraternité, right? Are you in one society here? And most importantly, the next further down, it'll ask, are they bound to defend the country? He's a general, right?
Yep.
It's not just the emperor. He's fighting wars on multiple fronts. He wants them to be fully part of the society, and part of that includes serving in the army. And again, one of the lines, okay, it's in the later answer. So again, he's asking this question about how fully integrated are they, and you can hear a Mendelssohn answer here. The true spirit of the law of Moses is consonant with considering Frenchmen as their brothers. And so, again, you're supposed to accept that their vision of things is that they are fully French. Now, was this the case in 1806? Maybe not. But is it the case today? Absolutely. French Jews consider themselves fully French. In fact, recently, when there were those terrorist attacks in Paris that included an attack on a kosher grocery store, and Benjamin Netanyahu went to Paris and he made a somewhat obnoxious statement in a synagogue there that they should come to Israel, and they stood to sing the Tikva at the end of the presentation. Spontaneously, the audience of French Jews stood up and sang the Marseillaise also. Because as much as they are supporting of the state of Israel and identifying as Jews, they are equally identifying as French Jews and not just as universal Jews. So that's been a transition. And so if you look at the sixth question, jumping forward a bit, asking, do Jews born in France, if treated by the laws of French citizens, consider France as their country? And they say in the third paragraph here, the love of the country is in the heart of the Jews, a sentiment so natural, so powerful, and so constant to their religious opinions, that a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers, although he may be among Jews. And the case is the same with English Jews in France. And he points out they served in the armies and fought each other. Now, was that the case in 1806? I'm not so sure. But today, if I were to go to Morocco, and meet a Jew living in Morocco, and then I meet another tourist from Chicago who's not Jewish, with whom would I have more in common? I mean, it depends on if it was a holiday or not, you know, what is my objective here. If I'm looking to purchase a menorah, I might have more in common with the Jew. But in most parts of my life, I'm going to have more in common with the non-Jewish Chicagoan than I will with the Jew living in Morocco. So in some cases, this is prophetic. Yes, Seth?
I think we skipped over what would the traditional answer be to the strangers and brothers.
Oh, yes.
So what would the traditional answer be about nationality and diaspora and those things?
Generally, that word diaspora almost nails it, because diaspora is the idea of an independent community in different places. But the Hebrew term for diaspora traditionally was galut. Galut meant exile. Mm-hmm. If you were in exile, what does that mean? It means you're not where you belong. It means you belong somewhere else. It means you hope for an end to that exile. For the Jews, they were an Am Segulai, chosen people. They were kept separate for a reason. They didn't want to intermarry with the surrounding cultures. They held themselves separate for many reasons. And they didn't look on their neighbors as their brothers. We read, again, how you read the text makes a difference. So there's a lot of nice passages in the Torah that talk about the ger. Ger is often translated as the stranger. You don't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. You love the stranger, and so on. You leave the gleanings of the field for the widow and the orphan and for the stranger. But in rabbinic practice, the word ger was translated as convert. Lagur was to live and reside, but gerut was conversion. So what they did was they took a universal sentiment of love the stranger and made it particular. Love the convert, who comes from somewhere else but has joined our group. It makes it much more of an in-group focused practice. So you're right, that this traditional answer would have been very different from the answer that these people gave. And if they had done a poll of French Jews in 1806, the answer might have been very different. But in some ways, it's kind of a secular prophecy that this is the direction things were going. Such that, many American Jews think nothing of serving in the American army, of serving in American government. They don't see a conflict between their ethnic Jewish identity and their larger national citizenship and identity. Yes?
Take a line from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Who are these guys? Who wrote this? Because we didn't have a high rabbi to to dictate. So who were these people who responded on behalf of the Jewish community?
Right. It was a collection of lay leaders and rabbis, so it was a mix. There were some rabbis involved. There were some, self-appointed rich heads of the Jewish community, and they were drawn together. I think it was 70 people, again modeling on the rabbinic Sanhedrin, that Napoleon assembled to write the answer. I think it was mostly self-selected by the major Jewish communities who the representatives would be. But again, they didn't vote. It wasn't a democratic process. Yes, they're
If Napoleon was anything, he was consistent in terms of, and what made it so revolutionary was imposing a civil order in all these Christian countries and separating the clerical authority from the civil authority. It was revolutionary.
And in many cases, breaking open the gates of the ghetto. When he went into Italy, when he went to Germany, he freed the Jews. And even afterwards, they tried to reimpose some of those standards, but the cat was out of the bag, right? Jews were out of the ghetto, and they wouldn't entirely go back. Right.
Yeah, was it just about the primacy of the rule of civil law? I mean, one of the things Napoleon did was he created this massive civil administration and so on, making a very potent secular state. But I'm curious what you would say about all of Napoleon's motivations.
Like I said, I'm not a trans-time psychologist.
No. I did, but in terms of was part of his motivation to tamp down the Jews as a troublesome people?
No. Part of the challenge with France at the time was we think of France as a unified nation, but it was a relatively recent unification. Provence was very different from Brittany, and Alsace-Lorraine was very different from Ile-de-Paris. So he was trying to create a unified French nation out of disparate peoples, which often had different customs and traditions and even languages that they spoke. Unified French wasn't assumed as a national language for a long time. Actually, Louis XIV and Louis XII were sort of the nationalizing forces, but that wasn't that far before Louis XVI is deposed. So he was trying to unify the French nation, and the Jews were one of many groups that he had to incorporate into that dynamic. Yes, Eva.
Just a quick question. So I think that's really interesting. You were talking about how Ger is often translated as convert in the rabbinic tradition. Is there any, in terms of people looking at the pre-rabbinic tradition, do people who are, in terms of experts in biblical Hebrew, do they think it had the same import?
Well, in general, it has the sense of like a resident alien. So, not like somebody would, wander in from Iran to the land of Israel and go pick up wheat out of your field. More likely, they were people who were not part of the dominant ethnic group, but were living in the territory. So you think, for example, in the David story, remember he lusts after the wife of someone serving his army. Her name is Bathsheba, but the person who he has to kill to get her is Uriah the Hittite. So he's a Hittite. He's not following the Jewish cult necessarily, but he's living in the territory, he's serving in the army, but he's still identified by his ethnic origins as being someone different. There are all kinds of rules where non-Jews living in the land still have to get rid of their chametz. Non-Jews living in the land still can offer sacrifices at the temple for sin atonement and other purposes. But they can only go so far in the courts, right? They can only go to the non-Jewish court. They can't go all the way to the Israelite or the Levite court. And so there's a sense of a resident alien status where you're not part of the privileged group that has all the privileges and all the responsibilities, but you still have some communal support, welcoming, and non-discrimination clauses. Think of it that way. Okay. So we haven't even gotten to Reform Judaism yet. The food is here. But,
just the drinks.
Just the drinks. Okay, fine. Good, I've got a few minutes left. So this emancipation process that Napoleon and the French Revolution begins, and as I said, you can't put the cat back in the bag. And it inspired these Eastern European enlighteners like Gordon to say, look what happened in the West. Look what the French Jews are doing. Look what the English Jews are doing. And it gives them optimism that if they will enlighten, perhaps their societies will also welcome the Jews in. Now, of course, in the 19th century, there were a whole series of social revolutions that transformed European life, but also Jewish life. There's an economic revolution of international trade. The steamship opens up huge markets for people at great distances. It also creates brand new industries. And the idea of the laissez-faire capitalism of Adam Smith says the government should get its hands out of the economy and let people develop freely. Now for Jews, that's a real boon, because they can get involved in new industries. And they like the fact that government isn't telling them what to do and what not to do in this direction. The irony is that often Jews have been more materially successful in capitalist societies than they've been in socialist and communist societies. I mean, Stalinist Russia was a disaster for the Jews. It was good in some ways, but in the long run it was terrible for Jewish life. Whereas a free capitalist economy like in the United States or in England was actually very successful for Jews. It's tough sometimes for our current left political sentiments to accept that, but historically that's one of the interesting phenomena of Jewish history. Most importantly, of course, because Jews are not landowners, because they're not invested in older industries, they can get involved in these new industries like newspapers, like stock markets, like railroads, like movies. Think of in America. It was an opportunity that Jews were able to get into because they were not tied to older industries. A second change we find in the 19th century is the urban revolution, where millions of people moved from farms to cities and from smaller towns to bigger towns. What that produces, of course, is a tremendous amount of dislocation, because now you don't have the traditional lifestyle and the traditional values. You're in the big city. You're in grinding urban poverty, which can starve you even worse than rural poverty can starve you. And also, of course, that leads to political revolutions, too, as the workers are so miserable that they have to change the circumstances of their employment and conditions, and that has a strong impact on Jewish life, as we'll see in the afternoon. There's a knowledge revolution. There's fields of geology, which studies the age of the earth, evolution, which studies how human beings and animals came to be, looking at history from a critical perspective and not just what tradition says, studying society and how it functions well. All of that is going to transform our sense of what it means to be part of a group, which clearly has an impact on Jewish identity. And there's a health revolution, too. Not only do we understand how the human body works, but we understand something about hygiene and about the importance of doctors washing their hands between patients, which had to be discovered the hard way. Yeah. Believe it or not, iron bed frames were a radical innovation to improve health. Because before, when you had wood bed frames, it would simply absorb the blood or whatever else would happen in the patient, and the microbes would grow and the bacteria would grow. An iron bed frame made it easier to clean the bedding and have more success. And so one example of this is infant mortality goes down tremendously. Whereas before you would have 10 kids and maybe 8 would live, now you'd have 8 kids and 7 would live. And that radically transforms the economy, but also can make you poor fast. Because when your 7 kids have their 7 kids, now the economy can't grow fast enough to absorb, and that's where all those millions of American Jews came from Eastern Europe, because they were being bred into poverty there, and they had to leave. When you look at the population numbers, it's striking. The Jewish population in Eastern Europe went up, even though the youngest were leaving for America, because there were just so many of them having so many kids, and because the mortality rates had gone down so quickly. Now, we also have to understand in the 19th century that there was a reaction against the Enlightenment. It's often called the Romantic movement. It was emphasizing emotion. It was emphasizing national identity and not an international Enlightenment reason perspective. You focus more on the folk, on the people, on folk tales, on traditional wisdom, on ethnic and national identity. And this kind of romantic ethnic nationalism we'll talk more about in the afternoon, because it's also one of the seeds of Zionism and ethnic Yiddish nationalism. But the big question post-Napoleon was, what does it mean to be Jewish if you're now a citizen? How different can you be? Are you just a German of the Mosaic faith, just like a Catholic and a Protestant can be German and their religion is a separate category? Or should you just convert and be European? Now, Jews were grappling with this on their own initially. But beginning in the 19th century, there are a series of reformers who show up who said, we need to change things in Jewish life. And not just clothing or languages, but even what we do in our religious settings. If we want to be German citizens, for example, it's really bad form to be longing for a return to Israel and a rebuilding of the temple. If we want to be enlightened modern thinkers, do we really want to start sacrificing animals again? Really? Are we going to say that? How can we find a balance between our traditional Jewish inheritance, which had all these beliefs, some of which we don't share anymore, and how we live our lives today? And are there ways that we can change our ritual practices to be more in conforming with the surrounding society and with an Enlightenment perspective? So I included in your packet a few summaries of some early conferences of Reform rabbis. Now we have to remember, none of these reforming rabbis were trained as Reform rabbis. They were trained as Orthodox traditional, there were no Reform seminaries here. They were trained as Orthodox rabbis, but they also had university degrees. Because now, as Enlightenment impacts society, universities are not church universities anymore. They're secular universities, and Jews can attend them. They get degrees in history, in philosophy, in theology, in literary studies. And then they bring that learning back to Jewish life and say, something's got to give here. We're going to need to make some changes. And sometimes it was controversial. There was a rabbi named Abraham Geiger, one of these founding Reform rabbis. He was born in 1810. In 1838, when he was 28 years old, he finished his rabbinic degree, he finished his university degree. He was appointed as the second assistant rabbi in the community of Breslau. And we have to remember, in Germany, they had what's called a Gemeinde system, where there was an official rabbi of the town. He was always Orthodox. But now, the official rabbi of the town, the junior one, was a reformer who wanted to make changes. And that was a big controversy, because some of the population liked what he had to say, and some of the population did not like what he had to say. Now, at the same time, these Reform rabbis are starting their work in Germany. There's the beginning of a process of reform in American Judaism as well. Now, American Jews are a very small part of the population before 1848, and there aren't a lot of them, but there also aren't a lot of rabbis, so they're doing it on their own. In Charleston, South Carolina, in the early 1800s, like 1815 or so, they decide to integrate the seating and have men and women sit together in family pews, just like their neighbors. In a few synagogues, they decide to have a sermon done in English and not in Hebrew. In some cases, in Germany in particular, they begin to add the pipe organ to their synagogues, because rational, enlightened people are inspired with the music of the pipe organ. Also, coincidentally, they're Lutheran neighbors. But it's just coincidental, it's purely rational and enlightenment-based. They decide to create a new ceremony. It's a ceremony called confirmation.
This is in Germany?
This is in Germany, beginning in the 1840s. It happens when the children are older. By the way, they decide to do education for both boys and girls from the beginning. That's an enlightened perspective. And so they decide to have a graduation event for those boys and girls happening around the age 15 or 16. Again, totally coincidentally at the same time that Lutheran totally coincidentally have a ceremony called confirmation. And in some cases, they drop the bar mitzvah, because they're not observing ritual commandments, as we'll see. They're observing moral commandments. And so why call it a bar mitzvah? Why make it about putting on tefillin? Why not make it about this elevated idea of confirmation? So if you talk to people raised in Reform Judaism, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, in some cases in the 1950s, their synagogues might not have had bar or bat mitzvahs, because they did confirmation. That's what they did. And at one time, boys had bar mitzvahs and girls had confirmations, because the bat mitzvah wasn't deeply rooted either until the 1960s and 70s. So we see the seeds of a lot of changes here. The liturgy begins to change. The dietary laws begin to change. Are you allowed to ride in your cart to the synagogue on the Sabbath or not? Are you allowed to open your store on the Sabbath or not? Because, of course, if you close your store on Saturday, and the surrounding culture closes everything on Sunday, you're at a competitive disadvantage to the surrounding culture. Because now, of course, your economy is not just based on Jews in a ghetto. It's based on everybody. You're living among them. You're eating with them. You're going to university with them. How do you balance this out? So I included in the packet a few examples of some of the early conferences of Reform rabbis and the kind of issues they grappled with. So in 1844, this is on page 23 of the packet. In 1844, they had a discussion of the religious services. What is the amount of Hebrew necessary for worship? Could it be 0? Does it have to be 100%? What's the balance? The repetition of portions of the service. There are parts where you repeat the same text over and over again. So the musaf, the additional reading. Does God need to hear it twice? Did he catch it the first time? Improvements in the Torah ritual and the use of the organ in the synagogue. They appointed a committee to report on the concept of the Messiah. Is it really a king from the line of David who's going to restore the temple in Jerusalem? If you sing Eliyahu Hanavi at Passover or other settings, it says, Bimhera b'yaminu, soon Yavo Aleinu, come to us, Im Moshiach ben David, with the Messiah, son of David. From the line of David to reestablish the kingdom. Is that what we mean by a Messiah?
Doesn't it seem like the whole idea of a Messiah is undermined by the fact that a committee could decide?
Well, the question is, they're beginning to explore, what do we believe about this? What is both reasonable for us to believe, and what do we want to teach Jews that they should believe? We appoint a committee to assess the problems of Sabbath observance, a committee to suggest improvements in the shofar and the lulav rituals, and investigating the marriage laws. So then in the next year, in 45, they come back and they report. The vernacular may be used in worship. Hebrew should be retained for certain prayers. Repetition of prayers is declared unnecessary, and an organ may be used in synagogue worship. So now they're allowing some change to take place. All prayers incorporating the idea of exile should be excised. Why do you remove the exile claims? Because we're not in exile anymore. There's a reason why the Reform movement called their buildings temples. Because we don't need a temple in Jerusalem. Our temple is in Hamburg, in Berlin, in Cincinnati. It was an explicit statement. Our paradise, our Palestine, our promised land is the land of our citizenship. And so in early American prayer books, for example, by the Reform movement, they put the Star-Spangled Banner in the back of the prayer book. Because it was a unification of their identities. Prayers for the rebuilding of the temple, restoration of sacrifices, should be written as expressions of the past instead of hopes for the future. So they can rewrite the texts. And prayer should convey the belief in a messianic age instead of a personal Messiah. This is kumbaya. This is not the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Status of women, appoint a committee. Sabbath observance. Jews are permitted to play the organ in the synagogue, and they postpone the report till the next conference. Holiday observances, they want to observe holidays and minor fasts, and again, marriage and divorce laws and mourning customs. So now, 1846, they decide to produce their own reform prayer book. Not the Siddur, but a reform Siddur. Status of women, they recommend equal status, but lack time to consider the man. So, Sabbath observance. Riding to the synagogue and playing the organ are not violations. A proposal to transfer the Sabbath to Sunday was rejected. So they even thought about doing it on Sunday.
When I grew up in a Reformed congregation in upstate New York, we had our services on Sunday.
But they weren't called Sabbath services. They were Sunday services. But they didn't call it Shabbat.
Yeah, probably not, but they did. I don't know that they did Friday nights. Or
They might not have. And in some communities, the Sunday service was the primary service, but it wasn't called the Sabbath. It didn't get the full transfer of everything that is involved in Sabbath observance. They maintained a distinction. But the fact that they considered the proposal for some was too much. There were some rabbis who left the conferences in 1845 when they considered dropping Hebrew. They said, how do you dare you even think about it? And they quit. And they formed a new movement called the Conservative Movement. That's why it's called conservative, by the way. From an Orthodox perspective, conservative is not conservative. It's changing. It's in response to reform that conservative is conservative. And that's why it got its name. So you can see how they're already contemplating changes, but also there's going to be a reaction against those changes. Notice the mourning customs. The practices of having mourners cut their garments, sit on the ground, abstain from shaving, bathing, wearing shoes. That's eliminated. It's all superstitious. That's backwards. That's not what elevated people do to mourn. We're going to do it the way elevated people do it. Instead of a 7-day mourning period, which is why Shiva is called Shiva, the word Sheva in Hebrew means 7. Now it's a 3-day period recommended. What we do now is like the weekend convenient or 2 days or whatever the family decides to do. But we still call it a Shiva, ironically, even though it's from the word 7. And the closing of one's business, at least on the day of the funeral, was agreed upon. I love that one. That you should at least close your business on the day of the funeral. Don't open up in the afternoon. That's like minimal standards here.
That's the old joke, well, who's minding the store?
Right, exactly. And then notice for holidays, they say the second day, the extra day of the holiday, is abolished except for Rosh Hashanah. So you don't need two observances of holiday. So you can see they're making some radical changes here to Jewish practice. Now there's a break in these meetings till the 1860s because of the revolution of 1848 and the conservative reaction against that. So by the 1860s, which is on the backside on page 24, you see a lot of changes have taken place. They use the organ and a mixed choir. Women are singing now, mixed gendered choir, even non-Jewish choirs involved in the synagogue service. The Torah portion is recited and not chanted. The Haftorah portion is read in translation, so people can know what you're saying. Big revisions in the prayer book. More congregational singing is recommended. They improve Jewish education for both girls and boys. Again, the Jewish women's piece is postponed to the next synod. See another pattern. Adding a memorial service for Yom Kippur. And then by 1871, you see finally the Commission on Women Reports and says women are eligible to be witnesses in ritual matters, which they weren't allowed to in Jewish law. The greater celebration of Hanukkah was advocated. I wonder why. And in marriage and divorce laws, brides were permitted to participate actively in the marriage ceremony. Before, you just accepted the ring on your finger. You didn't do anything. Now they could talk and move. A double ring ceremony in both directions was authorized. Jewish men traditionally didn't wear wedding rings. It was only the women. The so-called unlucky days preventing marriage were eliminated. Over the summer and between certain holidays, there are dates you're not supposed to get married. They said, superstition, forget it. The category of the agunah, the bound woman who couldn't get a divorce, or the yivamah, the woman whose husband had died without providing an heir, and she was bound to his brother, and this complicated, gone.
What about getting a get?
Gone. Didn't need it.
a get.
Didn't
When
need
did
it.
that happen?
This is the reform movement of the 1870s.
How about
Now,
the Kol Nidre?
Kol Nidre they kept. And Kol Nidre has been controversial for centuries because a lot of even Orthodox rabbis find it objectionable. What are you doing going around canceling all your vows and promises? How does that work? So that's not unique to Reform Jews. So a document, it's the last thing we'll look at before lunchtime today, ideally. Or maybe just relaxed chat time and then we'll teach through lunch. Is the Pittsburgh Platform of Reform Judaism, which was produced in 1885. It was done in America, it was written in English, but most of the discussions were probably held in German, because the first language of all the rabbis who were there at the conference was German. And in fact, for a long time, American Jewish life was run in German. They kept minutes of their meetings in German. The first American-produced prayer book by the Reform movement was done in Hebrew and German. And the second one was done in English.
This is an international country.
No, it was only American. No, it was only American. And again, given the transportation technology at the time, it was what they could do. So we're going to take a look at these principles here, these 10 points, and you'll see all of the ideological changes that have been made from a traditional perspective. 1. We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite, and in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man. We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our Holy Scriptures and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended amidst continual struggles and trials and under enforced isolation this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race. So what's radical? What's different about this perspective? About this
idea.
What?
God idea.
A God idea. Nobody prays for a God idea. It's very psychological.
Yeah.
Anything else?
The indwelling of God in man is.
As opposed to a transcendent God, you've got a more immanent God. Isn't this nice to other religions?
The idea that this was done in America in the German language goes a long way to explain the hostility between the established German Jewish immigrants who came earlier, and the Eastern European immigrants who came later.
That's right. The later social conflicts between the Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking immigrants and the establishment German immigrants. I mean, the Germans had these temples that were doing things in German with a choir and pipe organ, and these Eastern European Jews called them churches because they look like a church. They had a pipe organ, a mixed choir, talking German. What else is this thing? This isn't a synagogue. They didn't. It was just a foreign category for them, and the hostility was mutual. It went both ways. In fact, I read once that the epithet "kike" for Jews was actually developed by German Jews, talking about the Eastern European Jews whose names all ended in "ski." And the K-I at the end of it became the kike epithet. In any case, other interesting sides of this particular platform point, notice that the Jewish teachers taught this idea in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. In other words, if our age has progressed a little further, then we're going to teach it a little bit differently, because they were less advanced. Again, this is a very different perspective on past versus present.
It also seems like it's maintaining the concept of, but Judaism's really still the best.
Okay.
Like we could go to these other things that people might find to be more modern, but really Judaism's really still the best.
And what's interesting here is it's not that the Jewish people are the best. It's not that we're a chosen people. It's that we have the best idea. We have the best idea of this God idea, the best expression of it. And even though every religion has some part of the truth, this is, in some ways it's an heir to Jewish philosophy where you study the world, you can learn something about everyone can do it. It's part of the Enlightenment that everybody has some truth. But also it's a new kind of ecumenical dialogue that we didn't have before, that every religion has some part of truth in it, and we're just the best. But all of them have something, like you all get B's, we're an A, but you all get a B. Secondly, we recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God, and value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age, and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice dealing with men in miraculous narratives. What's radical about that?
These are nice stories, but they're the product of the time.
Right. Were there miracles?
Nah.
No. These were just miraculous narratives. They're stories. And they're the clothing for the deeper truths. But don't believe that there was Moses raising his hand and the water parting and the frogs coming down from the sky. Come on. That's not what happened. That's not how natural law works. So they're objecting even to that traditional concept, saying the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age. Woo. I mean, even using the word primitive.
Now, have they decided? Have they created the term reform yet? Or
Oh yes.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Absolutely.
So where did the conservative branch come
Well, so as I mentioned, the initial breakup of conservatives was in the 1840s in Germany, when they were beginning to contemplate changing the language, changing the Sabbath day. Some even discussed abandoning circumcision. So there were some really radical proposals out there, and conservatives said, forget it, we want to make some changes. We accept that, but this is going too far. They sometimes call themselves the historical school, because they wanted to be part of the historical process. Or in Hungary, it was called nail law, which is like new law. So it's creating a new kind of law system as opposed to the old one. So in Europe, in fact, the first Jewish theological seminary was in Breslau, in Germany. In America, initially there was an attempt made to make an American Judaism. So Isaac Mayer Wise, who becomes the founder of Reform Judaism, creates a union of American Hebrew congregations. He writes a prayer book called Minhag America, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. This is a reform in it. He wants it to be universal. And he creates a seminary called the Hebrew Union College, takes a bunch of high school students, and for 8 years he trains them. So in 1883, they're ready to have the first rabbinic ordination in America. And they invite all the rabbis around, including many traditionalist rabbis, who come, and by all reports, the ordination ceremony goes just fine. And then they go to dinner. They serve frog legs, and oysters, and shrimp,
Ooh.
It's often known as the Trefa banquet, or the shrimp dinner. And some of the rabbis see the food and march out in a huff, and 2 years later, the American Jewish Theological Seminary is formed. As a response to these reformers, these people making changes, just going too darn far. Now, there's a debate among historians over whether that was intentional or accidental. Did Wise say, we're going to put this on the menu to show them that we've moved beyond those silly rules, or was it he delegated it to a lay committee, and the lay people didn't know any better, and they put on what Cato recommended, and now afterwards Wise was very defensive about it. He didn't accept the criticism. If you go, by the way, to Philadelphia, there's a National Museum of American Jewish History. And actually, the Institute is running a learning trip to Philadelphia in this October, the 28th and 30th, where we'll be visiting that museum, among other interesting sites. But if you go there, they have a copy of the menu from that event. They have one of the original menus that somebody saved. You can see what they served at that banquet that led to the conservative movement breaking off from reform because it was too far. So at the same time that's happening, they're writing this platform. And actually, Wise was more of an accommodationist person. He wasn't as radical. The people driving this one were the more radical reformers who wanted to make a break with the past in many ways, as we'll see, not only in how they talk about the Bible. Notice, by the way, they use the word Bible. They don't say Torah. It's the universal term of the Bible that everybody respects as opposed to the Jewish-specific term of Torah. And notice they also claim the modern discoveries of scientific research in nature and history are not antagonistic to Judaism. Don't be afraid of biblical criticism, which is happening, of evolution, of archaeology, of geology. The core doctrines of Judaism are not whether there was or was not an Adam and Eve. For them, it's a more elevated concept. But they're trying to harmonize this Enlightenment reliance on reason and science and their Jewish inheritance, just like Jewish philosophy has from the beginning.
I'm wondering how the Reform movement decided which elements were kind of the essential elements of Judaism that they were going to stick with and which things were the things to throw out. Because growing up conservative, I feel like we heard a lot like, oh, those Reform Jews, they don't even keep kosher. They don't, you know, and like kind of the...
And what percent of your synagogue kept kosher?
Right. And then, but I...
What kind of kosher?
Right. And so, but I feel like there's sort of the like, well, we have a lock on what's the real Judaism, and I'm wondering like where that...
What I've heard people say is the real Judaism, they don't say this out loud, but the real Judaism is what they like, and the extraneous stuff is what they don't like. So I did a talk once, I did actually a seminar for our community in Toronto on the Talmud, sort of the humanistic approach to the Talmud and what it is. And I mentioned some of the absurd rules that are in there, obscure things. After the session, someone came up to me and said, well, but that's not the core of Jewish tradition. I said, well, how is it that what you like is the core and what you don't like just happens to be extraneous? I don't know that you can make that distinction. And we'll see that as well later on in this platform. So, number 3. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding only the moral laws and obtain only such ceremonies, and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So, what wins between tradition and modern civilization? Modern civilization. Right? If it's not adapted to modern life?
And the flip side of it is, that stuff's uncivilized.
Well, that's their perspective too, right? And again, you hear the Spinoza side of the law only applied to when we had a territory, and so now we don't have ritual laws, we don't have civil laws, all we have are moral laws. Now again, dividing the line between what's a moral law and what's a ritual law can be a question, but even more important here, you've got this concept of we are rejecting a large body of traditional Jewish laws, and even the concept of having binding laws. Whereas the conservative movement maintained an illusion of Jewish law, where they would say, well, we know people are going to drive to synagogue anyway, so let's come up with a reason to allow them to drive, and to bring the reason after that people were already doing it, and the vast majority of the population would totally ignore, so the synagogue is kosher, but I would bet you probably half to 2/3 of any conservative synagogue, the lay people didn't keep kosher in their private lives. And there was sort of the don't ask, don't tell approach to personal Jewish practice. The joke was that you got a conservative synagogue out of an Orthodox rabbi and a secular membership.
My other question, and maybe this is too far afield, but I'm wondering when in this history Jews started cheating with the well, we can hire a non-Jew to turn our lights off.
Well, that goes back a long way. That goes back a long way. The concept of the Shabbos goy, where you had someone who was a non-Jew for you, goes back a long time. And in fact, it says explicitly in the rabbinic laws, you're not allowed to pay or ask someone to do something for you that you can't do for yourself on the Sabbath, which would seem to totally undermine the Shabbos goy concept. But what they came up with was ways you could do it that you weren't explicitly asking for it. So you'd say to your neighbor, would you like to come over for a drink? And they come over in the house, and then you're in the room, and you say, boy, it's really dark in here. And then they turn on the light. So they're doing it for themselves. So you didn't really explicitly ask for it. It's a workaround. They have all kinds of categories like this. You have fictional sales of your chametz to non-Jews. You're a baker, you sell your bread store for a week to somebody, and hopefully they sell it back. There are legal workarounds, and that happens in secular law too sometimes. You have these crazy stuff to get the papers filed in my office. So that's one more example of that. That's not a function of the modern world. In fact, in the modern world, they decided to just ditch that stuff entirely, because now, again, being Jewish is in your tent, in your home, and the community, even the Jewish community, can't impose their standards on you in your private practice, if you're opening your store. There's all kinds of things you can do now that being an emancipated citizen facilitates it before you weren't able to do.
Just a humorous footnote. I used to be very close with some Orthodox friends in New York City, and I had carte blanche to come visit them on Shabbat because they were always home, and I took advantage of it until one day I shut off the light in the bathroom.
Oh.
And,
because you can't turn the light off.
Turn it back on.
And then you can't turn it back on again.
It wasn't that I transgressed by turning it off, but the inconvenience that they could not turn it back on again or ask me to do so.
Right.
I was I was the persona.
Right. Okay, so a couple of last items here, and then we'll take a little break. Number 4, all Mosaic and rabbinic laws that regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with the spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. Very strong protection. If you went into a Reformed synagogue in 1905, they would tell you to take off your hat. Men didn't cover their heads in an elevated, enlightened religious observance.
Did they work on defining what they meant by modern?
Not in an academic dissertation sense.
Okay.
Their sense was what we're doing now. Remember, this is pre-postmodernism. So modern means now. What people are doing today. But you can see, again, these things are entirely foreign to us. They obstruct, they get in the way of being inspired. So we're dumping them. These are the people who serve the shrimp dinner, right? They don't care at all. Number 5, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of David? No. The kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. It's like Christmas all year round, right? We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state.
This is pre-Herzl.
Well, it is. But it's also anti-Herzl. For a long time, the Reform movement was anti-Zionist. There was an organization called the American Council for Judaism, which was a Jewish anti-Zionist organization. It still exists, by the way. It's changed its mission a bit since there is actually an Israel. But their approach was, we are loyal American citizens. Judaism is purely a religion, and we want nothing to do with Jewish national identity. When they talked about helping those immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe into New York, they wanted to help their co-religionists. not our fellow Jews, not members of the Jewish family. They're co-religionists. Even if what they were doing in the Reformed Temple and what the Orthodox Jews were doing in the Shtibel in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, doesn't matter. They were our co-religionists because all we have in common is a religion. We are just a religious community. We are no longer a nation. And so ethnic markers like language, dress, diet, leave them. We are just a religious community.
So
Good?
the phrase in the first line there, the modern era of universal culture of art and intellect, does that refer to all of us as opposed to a Jewish belief, or is that?
No, it's universal. It's for everybody. That's an Enlightenment idea. And notice the Messianic Code is not for a state of Israel. The Messianic Code is the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men.
Christians, Jews, doesn't matter.
That's right. Kumbaya. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and at what point did Judaism declare itself not a theocracy anymore? Or did that kind of break happen? Because it's common.
Well, for some, it's still the case.
Yeah, right.
You know, some rabbis are in charge. It's God in charge.
Would indicate that there is still that kind of.
Well, all right, and this is a far afield answer to what we're covering in the seminar because it's not one of our roots. But initially, the Jews were a tribe and a nation with a king. After the exile from Babylon, 500 or so BCE, they were led by priests. The priests had a document that asserted their authority called the Torah. After the end of the priests with the destruction of the temple, you had a Maccabee period, which was sort of kings, but they were sort of king priests at the same time. You have the rabbis, and the rabbis are ruling by religious law. Now there are machers in communities that are making, policy decisions and negotiating with the outside powers and so on. They're the ones hiring the rabbis. But in theory, the society is governed by Jewish law, which is determined by the Jewish judges of the rabbis. So it's really only in the modern period, post-Enlightenment and Emancipation, when that power of policing that the rabbis used to have is eliminated or greatly reduced, that you have enough Jewish freedom to say it isn't a theocracy anymore. And then it becomes what I described earlier as democracy, where the movers and shakers are the ones who are making decisions, as opposed to the religious authorities. But that's much later innovation. Okay, I wanted to point out also, number 6 is talking about that Christianity and Islam as being daughter religions of Judaism. And then they describe what their mission is. We appreciate their providential mission to aid in the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. We acknowledge the spirit of broad humanity of our age as our ally in fulfilling our mission, and we extend the hand of fellowship to those who cooperate in the establishment of the reign of truth and righteousness among men. So this is the Jewish mission. This is what you hear today in Reform Judaism when people are embarrassed by the concept of the chosen people. Oh, we're not chosen because we're special. We're chosen for a mission. We were chosen for the mission to spread monotheism around the world, which is why we wrote it in Hebrew that nobody understands. And we never sent missionaries anywhere, and why we're so high in the barriers to people joining Jewish identity, and obviously it's apologetics again. We didn't have this universal mission to spread monotheism, but that's what's plausible in a modern era of diversity and shared endeavor. Yeah.
I'm wondering why they didn't take one step further and say, and reject the religion altogether.
That's the next reading in the
okay.
packet.
That was really all this just reconfirms strongly, the view all religions are basically humanly created, the conception of God, miracle, not miracle.
I remember some Catholics said that.
Just listening to you.
Some Catholics had that revelation when they got to eat meat on Fridays. I said, what? For all these years it was fish on Fridays, and now all of a sudden that eternal truth has changed? How does that happen?
And lunch is late because they ran out of frog legs and they
So let's look at number 7. It's like, oh yes,
About kind of a connection to Lutheranism as well. Being in Minnesota, some of my best friends. One friend who's like father and grandfather and great-grandfather were Lutheran ministers. And so we've had many discussions about her current observance and participation in me as a humanistic Jew and how that evolved. And, I just can't believe all this stuff about these miracles and what happened in the Bible. She says, well, Howard, look, she's in the mainstream ELCA, and she says, a lot of that stuff we just take as stories. as narratives, as things that propel moral discussions. And what's important. It's not that it actually happened or that we have to believe that it's true. And we're allowed to do that in my Lutheran tradition. And I said, well, okay, there we go. It's human. This is all humanly created.
But notice also that that's the same move that these rabbis are taking.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying. The parallel of, I'll have to tell her she was very rabbinic.
No, but actually, what this shows you is assimilation has sort of a negative connotation, but the influence of the surrounding trends in liberal theology have on each other. So that, ironically, we often think of these silos of Jews, Christians, Muslims, but sometimes if you cut it this way, the liberals versus the fundamentalists or the traditionalists, they have more in common on the ideology level.
Yes,
and so liberal rabbis can have an easy ecumenical dialogue with liberal Protestant theologians and some liberal Muslim thinkers, because they share that allegorization of the myth and the synthesis between science and revelation and so on. Yes, I will get to number 7, I promise.
I think one of the things is this loud enough, Margot? Can you hear me?
I wasn't just speaking for myself.
Okay. That, like, if I've been to every kind of different synagogue, and even in Reform, they say the traditional stuff. And I say to the people sitting in the chairs, do you believe that stuff? And they say, no, of course not, but that's the tradition. Right. The difference between them and us is we changed our books so we don't have to say those words we don't believe.
Now, what's interesting with Reform is, as we saw, they started with changes. They said, we don't believe in the Messianic Messiah as a personal figure. We want a Messianic age. We don't believe in a return to Israel. We'll cut out the exile. We don't believe in rebuilding the temple and the sacrifices. We're going to change that. So they started by making changes. Now, what they changed was they generally cut. They were less inclined to dig in and reword. It was easier to cut out than it was to change the wording. And the second piece is that the Reform movement has evolved a lot since the 1880s. There's actually a new Pittsburgh platform that came out in 1999, and they went back to Pittsburgh on purpose because they wanted to supersede this one. Because where they are today is very different from where this is on the page. And if you read the 1999 Pittsburgh platform, they bring a lot of Hebrew back in. They use the word Torah again. They talk a lot about God as a personal figure, not the God idea. And there's a lot of pieces that are, some of them are more progressive in terms of gender identity and inclusiveness and intermarried families, but there are other pieces that are more traditional than this version because it's swung the other way.
You said 1999?
1999. You can find the next one. It's a different seminar where we look at that in person. I want to finish number 7, so that means you have to hold on the comments for 1 second. Go ahead. So number 7. We reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of the human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. We reject, as ideas not rooted in Judaism, the beliefs in both bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden, hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. I'll tell you what I love about this one. So many things I love about this one. The first one is, why do they believe the soul is immortal? What is the reason they give here? Is it revelation? No. The soul is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of the human spirit. We observe how people behave, and we see that they like good and they shun evil. And therefore, we come to the logical conclusion that the soul is immortal. Again, rational, logical, okay? But they're not basing it on revealed text. They're not quoting the Bible to prove this belief. They're using the categories of philosophy, evidence, reason to try and claim that this belief is reasonable and rational. And what do they reject? They reject, as ideas not rooted in Judaism, bodily resurrection, and Gehenna and Eden. They even use the Hebrew names for them, for heaven and hell. They use the Hebrew names for them, and then claim they're not rooted in Judaism.
Whoa.
This is the origin of that story that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. Well, Reformed Jews were told not to believe in an afterlife, and enough of them were told it that they believed it eventually. But if you look at the sources we saw in Maimonides' list of the 13 things he believes in in plenty of other pieces in the liturgy, there's a belief in a resurrection and a world to come. But they decided to say, nope, that's out. That doesn't count. And we talked about the core versus the experience. This is one they said, this is not the core. For Maimonides, it was the core. But for the Reformed Jews, it's not.
Okay, I was taught, yes, we don't have anything, but the humanistic rabbi that I first encountered Judaism under, he said, it's not in the Torah that there's a heaven or hell. He said there was just some little phrase that talked about the darkness or something. So, and that was in Cincinnati, Rabbi Bar.
Okay.
So is he right? Or, I mean, the hell and heaven, that in the Torah there was no...
Remember, the written Torah doesn't define Judaism. So, there's the rest of the Bible, for example. In the book of Daniel, it says very clearly, there's a resurrection.
There is? Okay.
In the book of Daniel, absolutely. Chapter 12, verse 2. Fine. But you can also find in the Mishnah, which is the rabbinic collection of laws from 200 BC to 200 CE, in the Talmud, which defines what halakha and Jewish practice was for the following 1,000 years, there are lots of examples of resurrection of the dead, of restoring in a judgment day the dead to life. If you read what's called the Amidah, the standing prayer, one of them is blessing God for the resurrection of the dead. So the question is does the Torah define Judaism, or in the rabbinic sense of the written and oral Torah, which includes Mishnah and Talmud and the Siddur and the prayer book, well, that version clearly has a resurrection of the dead. Now the question is, and what the rabbis here were claiming, is that those were ideas imported during the Talmudic period from Zoroastrian and other religious traditions. So that's what they say, not rooted in Judaism. They mean real Judaism was before that. They didn't like the Talmud in Reformed Judaism because it's all those religious laws and ritual laws. They preferred to emphasize the Bible, in particular the prophets. So they would, for example, quote the prophetic books that say, I don't want your sacrifices. Do justice and do good. Now, the claim in the prophets was actually you should do both. I don't want your sacrifices if you're not doing justice. But you should really be doing both. But for the reformers, they read that to mean we don't need to sacrifice because we're doing justice instead. That's the moral laws and not the ritual laws. So again, how you read it makes a big difference. So in any case, whether it was the social dynamic of people acculturating or the religious reformers with their ideology, you can imagine a whole bunch of changes take place in organized Jewish life. They changed the language and structure of the services. The services sometimes wind up longer because you do it in Hebrew and English instead of just in English, just in Hebrew. The amount of Hebrew used changes. Now, not only the sermon, but even the service is often read in the vernacular language. The concepts of God, creation, revelation, those are still accepted, even if they reinterpret a bit what that means. And they have, in some ways, an evolving sense of how they react to the surrounding culture, what they include and what they don't. Now, as I mentioned, Reformed Judaism has changed a lot. Post-World War II, you had large numbers of Eastern European Jews coming in. They brought with them a more ethnic Jewish identity, supportive approach to Zionism. They brought back the Bar Mitzvah to Reformed Judaism. And it sort of changed the dynamic of Reformed Judaism. Also, the experience of the Holocaust really undermined that optimism and progress and universal brotherhood, and we are no longer a nation. So much so that by 1936, they issued a new platform called the Columbus Platform, and even there they softened the anti-Zionism stuff. If you look at the Columbus Platform, 1935, if you read the Columbus Platform, it's much softer on the Zionism. They support helping to build a refuge for the Jews in Palestine, and they've even evolved a bit by the 1930s. So that when you read the 1999 platform, you see how it evolved over time. And I'll mention just in passing, the conservative movement, this historical school, even if it becomes conservative Judaism, also is the origin for modern Jewish studies and looking at Jewish history from an academic perspective. So, what are our roots in this Reformed Judaism, Enlightenment, Emancipation period? Yes, I know that was here. Yes, we're going to finish this and then eat. What are our roots?
the belief or the desire to make changes to adapt Jewish culture to the modern or the current situation.
Yep.
There's like some undercurrent, even though we're not at the Holocaust, in those areas of like survivalism. That's what now we're not just bubbling, making a bubble to survive, but now integrating into urban areas and into different cultures. And it seems like the change is coming from a desire to thrive.
Well, and this is the irony. Reform Judaism gets blamed for assimilating and leading people astray, but it actually kept people Jewish. If there had not been a Reform Judaism in the 19th century, many, many more Jews would have converted out to be something else, like Heine, like Mendelssohn's kids, who were pre-Reform Judaism. They wanted their European culture and their Judaism, and that's what Reform Judaism enabled them to do.
I think that just to assimilate to the culture, but contribute, which is still a little bit of that, exceptionalism where, we've got a lot to offer.
All the Nobel Prize winners and all the scientists, comedians.
I was just going to say, because like now we feel more comfortable in it's not a matter of survival, it's a matter of giving, the more people want to be more involved in that.
Well, and certainly if you read that history platform, one of the clauses we didn't read, number 8, is very much focused on at the time was the social gospel, the progressive era, uplifting the downtrodden and doing social works. And that was a prominent part of Reform Judaism going back into the 19th century. Julius Rosenwald is one example who funded lots of schools for African Americans in the South. And he was a Sears Roebuck magnate, but was a member of a Reform synagogue and took those messages of the human action in improving the world to heart.
Yeah, you asked this question about what gets tossed out and so on. And I'm really struck by how much abides. That we are who we are, we are indelibly, deeply Jewish. I'm a little less entitled to say in those words than
more recently.
But yes. But, as an academic anthropologist, I'm well aware how many people in cultures around the world are not mindful of their own culture whatsoever. And one of the things that strikes me, or it's something I'm wondering about, is the mindfulness, whether a mindfulness of one's own culture is something else that abides in a very, very significant way.
What was interesting in Reform Judaism is some of the changes happened like organically from the ground up. Like lay people said, we want mixed seating, or we want a pipe organ, we want to translate this. And in other cases, they were top down, where the rabbis are making decisions and saying, this is what you do. So, for example, in that clause that said that the laws about diet, purity, and dress are entirely foreign, and they obstruct rather than inspire. Who are you to say that for everybody? Maybe for some people they find it inspiring. But the Reform rabbinate decided, we will make the determination for you. Take off your hat when you walk in the synagogue. And so that's more of a top-down process. Yes, over there.
I'm interested in the idea of evangelism and why I haven't experienced certainly any Jewish evangelism. Is that just a function of fundamentalists?
Well, this is a lot of the history. Remember, we talked about in the Middle Ages, it was illegal to do that in both Muslim and Christian territories. So it's hard to get a tradition of something that will kill you if you do it. And at the same time, there was a sense that the Jewish people were a people apart. And why would you dilute that by bringing in more people? That is, if you're part of this chosen nation, the other nations are separate. Remember the word goy, which means non-Jew, literally means nation. It's just everybody else. The other 99.95% of the world is the non-Jews. So, last thought on a couple of roots from this period. Certainly the changes in Jewish ritual and liturgy, even changing what a rabbi is about, because the rabbi is now a preacher, is a philosopher, is leading the community, but not deciding Jewish law because you kicked that out. The idea that Jewish history is important to study and can justify changes in practice. The idea that the lay people can make things that change and the rabbis have to respond to them. It's not just the rabbis that impose change, but the ordinary people can make a choice about intermarriage or about other things. We want to have a critical study of the past, not just accept it, and that sometimes the present is more valuable than the past, or we agree with the present more than we agree with the past. And our values may reflect the present more than they do our inheritance. And as I mentioned, that desire to stay Jewish. Now, I've broken with my own tradition in teaching this class on roots, including Reform Judaism. Because if you read our anthology, Judaism in a Secular Age, or you read our other textbook for this class for the credit students, The Early Modern European Roots of Secular Humanistic Judaism, they don't talk about Reform Judaism. Now, why not? Have I made it seem so mind-blindingly obvious that it should be included? Well, this version does have a chapter on Reform Judaism, but this one doesn't. And the reason why is because when Reform de-ethnicized Judaism and made it about something else, it was about religion. It's about God. It's about our mission. And so for the first generation of secular and humanistic Jewish thinkers as a movement, we were breaking away from that identity. I mean, Sherman Wein was a Reform rabbi. Dan Friedman was a Reform rabbi. Bob Barr was a Reform rabbi. And so they left that Reform movement behind and wanted to mark that break by saying this is not necessarily where we get these ideas. Where I see there are enough affinities sociologically between the kind of changes they made and the kind of observance we follow that it makes sense to talk about it. But we have to admit that even this Pittsburgh platform of 1885, there are parts of this I wouldn't agree with. I agree with more of it than I do Maimonides. But there are still parts that are very God, religion, revelation focused that are still not relevant to my secular humanistic Judaism.